Greetings, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar on the top 10 compliance findings and trends. My name is Joanne Dashiell, and I'm the Executive Director at HEAG, the Higher Education Assistance Group, and I will be moderating today's session. I'm joined by my colleague, Karen Wright Moore, who will be sharing the bulk of the information with you. Karen has over 25 years of experience in higher education, and she oversees each of our consulting engagements, so she has a lot of experience and some great tips to share with you.
As Joanne said, we are really excited to present this information to you today. We thought that it would be really helpful to both have a conversation about compliance and give you some takeaways that you may be able to use on your campuses to address some of these issues that could potentially come up in your annual audits and or program reviews. So for today, we're going to be reviewing the top 10 compliance findings and trends. And as Joanne mentioned, a part of my role as Vice President of Compliance and Quality Assurance is to oversee all of the compliance work for HEAG. And within that role, we have a really great opportunity to kind of understand some of the trends so that we can share that information with you today. As we present these trends to you in these categories, we'll include some of the regulatory citations for your reference. Joanne will be sharing a handout at the end of the webinar. We'll also be listing within those categories of the top trends, the top 5 specific findings within that particular area. We also thought it would be helpful to provide the top 10 takeaways from our perspective, and that's just information that you can take back to your campuses and help you to better navigate some of these compliance issues that may pop up on your campus. And most importantly, we'll be answering questions throughout the webinar today.
Just a little bit of background, really brief here, because we have a lot of content to go through. We are based in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and for over 28 years, we've provided comprehensive financial aid consulting services to colleges and universities across the country. And you can see the variety of services that we offer, the Title IV compliance support, and you're going to hear some of the results from our deep dive compliance assessments today. We also offer office evaluation and business process reviews. This is where we go on campus and we review all of your financial aid operations and provide suggestions on how you can optimize your systems, your technology, your workflow and communications to create efficiencies and best support your students and families through the process. We also provide interim staffing solutions, and that is a range of support there from financial aid counselor level all the way up through director of financial aid. And we also offer technology solutions. We have consultants who are experts on Banner, PowerFlaze, and all of the systems that come in and help you optimize those platforms so again you can create efficiencies and best support your students.
And so with that, thank you, Joanne. And with that, one of the things that is great about HEAG and is different from most annual audits or program reviews that you might experience is that we do take a deep dive into not only the financial aid functional and tactical operations, but who you are as an institution, what your profile is, who your demographics are for your students, and what are the major contributing issues that are within the financial aid office? And it may not be within the financial aid office. We also speak with, all of those other departments that are dependent on, that the financial aid office depends on for the receipt of information. And so we really become a part of the fabric of who you are to help you to build those relationships to address these global institutional compliance issues. And so as I look back over some of the compliance reviews and other compliance assessments and work that we've done most recently, there were a few things that popped out. And the number one on our list is consumer information. And as we talk about consumer information, it's important to recognize that that is the information that is public to your constituents and your students and your families, and those that are considering attending the institution or the college. But more important, it's also the point of entry for a program review. That's where they would start looking at who you are publicly and your public profile. And so as we visit some of our clients, we identified some of the areas that are most challenging for our clients in this area. And so as you'll see, and this is the format for each of the slides, we have the regulatory citations, but consumer information is information that a school must disclose to the public and report to the Department of Education. And from our perspective, the top 5 HEAG consumer information compliance trends are the availability of information, general student disclosures, gainful employment programs, campus crime and safety information, and drug and alcohol abuse prevention. So let's just talk about each of those briefly. The availability of information, as we see it for most of our client schools, the number one issue has been the annual notice to students. And most of our schools have their consumer information, published on their website in some form or another, but they kind of forget about that annual notice to students, and that notice must be individual to students. Also, the general student disclosures, one of the criteria under the general student disclosures is the net price calculator, and we often find that there are challenges with getting that up on your website or, working with your IT departments to make sure that it's updated and updated timely. And as we talk about the gainful employment programs and disclosures, the number one thing that we find in that area is that they are not easily accessible. Some of our clients have not posted their gainful employment disclosures, but most are posted, just not easily accessible. And just remember that the regs require that it be prominently displayed, but not only prominently displayed on your website, but also cross-referenced to every other page on your website that mentions that gainful employment program. And so as we conduct compliance assessments, one of the things that we do first is to understand who the college is by navigating through that public information. The next area within consumer information is campus crime and safety information. Again, it's going back to those annual disclosures and making sure that they are individually distributed. And the annual disclosures are basically telling your constituents what kind of information is disclosed and what they should expect to find and where they can find it. And more importantly, the content of your campus crime and safety information, for example, preventing dating and domestic violence and sexual assault on your campuses, but also making sure that you have written procedures that you follow when those types of instances are reported. For those of you that have campus housing, the fire log has been one instance where we've noticed a lot of colleges don't have a fire log for their student housing, and so that's important. And then drug and alcohol abuse prevention. The annual distribution is important, and that's obviously becoming a theme with this consumer information, but also the content. And for those of you that have campus-based programs, make sure that your drug and alcohol abuse prevention program has the component for the drug-free workplace. And all of this means that you'll need to truly partner with those other offices on your campuses to make sure that there is an institutional understanding and ownership of these consumer information requirements. On so many different occasions, we've engaged with aid administrators across the country, and the challenge is having that institutional approach to some of these things that are outside of the financial aid office, and your IT departments are critical to ensuring that your consumer information is distributed and it's distributed timely and that it's updated so that when the Department of Education or your auditors or in the instance of an HEAG compliance assessment, when we go to determine who you are as an institution, we get a really thorough understanding of who you are, what you do, and how you do it.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. So that is the number one common finding area. All right, next up, the number two finding. Let's talk a little bit about record keeping and schools' responsibility around protecting student information.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joanne. So schools must maintain detailed records to show that funds are dispersed in the correct amounts to eligible students, and that personally identifiable information in those records must be safeguarded and can only be released under certain conditions. And so you want to make sure that you understand what those conditions are. But the top 5 HEAG record keeping and privacy trends surround records relating to student eligibility, record retention periods, disclosures to school officials, safeguarding confidential information in electronic processes, and protecting student information. And so when we talk a little bit about student eligibility, one of the things from a financial aid administrator's perspective is the ability to understand the profile of the student before they reach your office, before you receive an ISER for that student. Those eligibility criteria are maintained by your admissions and registrar's offices. Things like verification of high school completion, documentation of SAP, admissions documentation. Some schools rely on their admissions department to provide proof of high school completion. And you just want to be really, really careful, particularly those of you that rely on the student's self-certification on the ISER. If the institution requires a high school diploma for admission, then you need to be able to make sure that you have that in your records or you have access to that. And that's been one of the things in our compliance assessments that's come up fairly often. Next, the record retention period. I know that the record retention periods vary depending on the type of Title IV fund. So, for example, records are required to be maintained for 3 years after the end of the award year. Those administrative records like reports and things like that. But for student level records, records are required to be retained for 3 years from the end of the award year that the student last attended. And then for Perkins loans, there's an even different retention requirement. It's 3 years from the date that the loan was assigned to the department or canceled or paid in full. And so it's important to understand what those specific record-keeping requirements are. For example, even for Perkins loans, we talked about Perkins loans, but for a program review, records are required to be kept until the issue is resolved. And so if you hit that 3-year point and you still have an open program review or any other investigation or examination, you're required to maintain those records until the issue is resolved. The next one, which is disclosures to school officials, is a really hot button topic for us. And it goes back to privacy and safeguarding and protecting student information. But one of the things that we recommend that institutions do is make sure that in your consumer information that you've actually identified who the school officials are and the legitimate educational interest of those officials for those records. And so we've had varying different experiences with a variety of different people across the institution having open access to student records, and the requirement to document what those legitimate educational interests are, is really critical. And that's one of the things that's really important from a program review perspective, to make sure that you understand who's managing and handling those records and what the purpose of their access to those records is. And then safeguarding confidential information in electronic processes is just as important. And what we found, particularly with the importance of student information systems on campuses, sometimes the access to the student information system allows individuals who should not normally have access to student records have access to those records. And I'll give you a perfect example. In one of our compliance assessments, the payroll department had access to the student information system, and they were printing out files for work study students, and they were printing the ICER and the DL document, the direct loan documentation, and verification documents, completely maintaining a completely separate full financial aid file for the work study recipients. And so you really have to question yourself as an institution and ask, what is the purpose of having that student data available to that specific department, in this example, for the purpose of managing and paying the federal work study funds. And so make sure that those that have access to your student information system or any other technology within the institution have a legitimate reason, and that you have some internal controls on how that information is accessed and what the uses are for that information. And then protecting student information, that's really important. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act requires that you have written information security programs that protect your student information. And within that written program, you're also required to designate an employee who's responsible for coordinating that program. And so personally identifiable information, PIE, which is the acronym, is really important on your campus. And again, it's a global, interdependent requirement that is usually overlooked when we're so busy understanding and validating verification and return to Title IV and common origination and disbursement and things like that. And so consumer information, record keeping, and privacy are number one in terms of what we see as those areas that have the potential to trip up our aid administrators and cause compliance concerns.
Great, thank you, Karen. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and we get this all the time. We see this happen a lot too. Is it safe to email student documents? What's your recommendation on that? How do we safeguard information when we're sharing it electronically?
Yep. In general, it is not safe, and I know that IT departments across the country on college campuses have implemented all types of security programs and encrypted data programs and things like that. But if you have an intranet or some other means by which to share student information, more importantly, some of those checks and balances within your student information system will alleviate the need to email student information internally. If for those colleges that distribute college email addresses, those are usually secured within the confines of your server. And so it's really important to partner with your IT department to ensure that those safeguards are in place, because we hear just in our personal lives, I believe it was Starwood Resorts had a data breach last week, and we've had Target and Amazon. And so I always say to our consultants and even my staff throughout the years, imagine if the data that was breached was yours, and imagine if it were your financial aid file. And so as a director of financial aid or an aid administrator, I always want to put myself in the position of the student and having to deliver the news that that data has been breached. And so partnering with your information security team is key to success in protecting student data.
Absolutely. Great tip, great advice. All right, moving on to the third most common category when it comes to our compliance-related findings. This is a big one. We get lots of questions about satisfactory academic progress. And of course, the regulations require that we make sure that students are meeting timely progress related to their degree in order to be eligible for Title IV financial aid. So Karen, let's talk about some of the specific findings that we see as we're assessing overall compliance with satisfactory academic progress, or also, frequently referred to as SAP.
Yep, absolutely. To be eligible for FSA funds, and everybody knows this, a student must make satisfactory academic progress, and a school must have a reasonable policy for monitoring that progress. And so for us, the top 5 HEHE SAP trends are really just the basic elements of a SAP policy. And every aid administrator knows that you have to have a quantitative and a qualitative evaluation and an evaluation of the maximum time frame. But a lot of times what we see is within the written policy, some of our experience has been that the policies don't necessarily address how incomplete or repeated coursework or withdrawals are treated in the SAP evaluation. And so every school is different, and you have the authority to write your SAP policy as long as it's compliant and within the guidelines of the regulations. But it's really important to make sure that those basic elements are there. If you have a financial aid warning system, then you have to have that documented. If you evaluate payment period or annually, then you need to have that documented. So after you have a well-documented satisfactory academic progress policy, you really need to establish internal control to make sure that you're executing that written policy. And in so many instances, we've seen colleges have a beautifully written SAP policy, but the actualization of that policy on the campus doesn't support the written policy. And so, for example, the financial aid administrator may rely on the academic folks to evaluate SAP. And they've already done all of the background and the legwork, and the academic folks academic progress. And when evaluating SAP, the academic folks are evaluating SAP at the end of every semester, and financial aid may have different payment periods, and not necessarily at the end of a semester, particularly for those of you out there that have a variety of different program types and academic calendars. So just really partner with your academic colleagues to make sure that for each of the programs of study, they understand the evaluation period, they understand the components of the SAP policy, and they're also communicating that timely and effectively to the financial aid department within a system of record. Is always the preferred method, but if you don't have a system of record, then make sure that that communication is a well-oiled machine, and that you understand who's making SAP and who's not making SAP. And so really execute that written policy. We get a lot of questions around appeals and financial aid probation with or without an academic plan. And one of the things that we see most often is several different probationary periods that are back to back to back. And so a student doesn't meet the standards of probation, and the probation is extended for a variety of different reasons. And so just understand that if you don't have a warning system, and remember that the probation, a student can appeal And if the appeal is successful, they can be placed on probation with or without an academic plan. A probationary period is only for one payment period. And if the student fails at the end of that payment period, then the student is no longer eligible. However, with an academic plan, if the student is meeting the terms of that plan, then the student continues to be eligible for FSA programs. And so it's really important to kind of plot out what these instances are and what these examples are. And so, student A could be on probation, student B could be on probation with an academic plan, and just to really work through what that looks like so that you can build your internal controls around who's eligible for Title IV and when they're eligible. Most importantly is documenting the outcomes of your SAP evaluation. And again, with electronic processes and systems of record, it can really become a blurred line. And in a lot of busy aid offices, you run a SAP evaluation on, 1,000 students, and you've programmed your report to only show you the students who are not making SAP. And so just remember that for those students that are making SAP, you need to be able to document that you've evaluated those students, and that either needs to be in your system of record, in the student's individual financial aid file, depending on how you manage your office. But it's important to manage those that are not making SAP, but it's just as important to document that you've evaluated SAP, particularly for those disbursement points. And so that's important, and just kind of figure out how you do that. And then resolving conflicting information is a tough one because conflicting information, number one, as aid administrators, we don't always have access to information outside of financial aid and new information that comes in. And number two, conflicting information can be subjective in some cases, and we experience that a lot internally as well with our own consultants. And so it's important to partner again institutionally to make sure that all of those offices outside of the financial aid office understand that as a condition of Title IV eligibility, you and the student are required to resolve conflicting information. And so if a grade comes in late after you've evaluated SAP, it's important that faculty understand the importance of having that information to the financial aid office and the academic deans, and whatever your communication flow is, it's really important to be able to understand that. And I know that we've seen a lot of financial aid SAP policies that were written so as to put the onus on the student to notify you if there is a grade change. And so that is no longer the case. We have to be sure that we resolve those instances of conflicting information. And so that particular instance is referenced in the handbook as the primary example of conflicting information. And so make sure that you cover the basic elements of a SAP policy, that you actualize that policy in your operations, that you understand the probation and academic plans requirements, and that document the outcomes and make sure that you resolve any conflicting information.
All right, we're screaming right along now with number 4. So federal work study. Again, a lot of requirements under this one as well, Karen. So what are our top 5 findings within this category? And should schools be paying attention to here?
Yep. And so the federal work study program is near and dear to my heart, and I am so excited when we have a compliance assessment for an institution that is really, really focused on the federal work study students and the program and making sure that they meet all of these benchmarks. And so our top 5 trends for federal work study are challenges with the job descriptions, either not having job descriptions that are assigned to the students are having a general job description assigned to all students, timesheets, not having student signatures on timesheets, manual timesheets or paper timesheets are absolutely fine, as long as you document that document the work for the students and exclude those break times, reconciliation requirements in the federal work study program requirements, and then making sure that students can earn during periods of non-attendance as long as they're scheduled to attend the next period and that they have need. And so let's talk a little bit about job descriptions. And so many of our clients have either had a general job description that is applicable to all federal work study students or no job description. It's very rare for us to find separate and distinct job descriptions for each of the individual work study assignments. We've also experienced federal work study programs that are highly technical in terms of how the students report their time. Some of them have time stamps where the student is using technology to swipe a card when they walk on site or if they report to work, and some of them are using paper timesheets, and both are okay as long as they're compliant, as long as you are able to document how many hours the student worked and how many hours the student was on break, and that there is some authoritative signature on the timesheet reflecting that someone has acknowledged and validated this work and that the student is signing the timesheet. It's also important to make sure that there are timesheets for every period during which the student worked. And then the reconciliation requirements for work study. We've seen some really interesting ways of reconciling federal work study, and the one that we've seen on 3 separate occasions and that we recommend that you not do is allow students to work throughout the year. For example, a lot of colleges have both college work study and federal work study, and basically the college is kind of truing up the federal work study or reconciling at the end of the year. They're paying the student out of college funds and then drawing down at the end of the year from the federal work study program funds to repay the institution. And so a part of the reason that you need to reconcile each month, similar to your direct loan programs, is so that you can make sure that the student is not earning more than they were awarded and that you don't have any over awards or overpayments, but also that you are drawing down only the funds that you need to pay your eligible students at that time. And so you should think of the work study reconciliation through the same lens as your GL reconciliation and reconcile those funds monthly, but also it helps you establish those internal controls to identify students who are no longer reporting to their federal work study assignment, or those students that are exceeding the number of hours that they're eligible for. And also that you're making the requisite matches when you apply those funds to the student.
I have a question here. If a supervisor signed off on the work study timesheet, is a requirement for the student to also sign?
The student has to sign the worksheet as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for the question.
Mm-hmm. And so the community service and literacy requirements, that was a really big one several years ago, and schools were challenged to find opportunities for community service and literacy requirements. It seems that we've improved significantly in that area, but we have also identified institutions that are not placing students in these roles, and they also don't have a waiver. And so you want to make sure that you understand what those community service positions can be and cannot be, and make sure that your students and that you establish those relationships with the academic side of the house. And there are so many different profiles for how students are placed in community service and work study jobs, and just make sure that everyone who's involved with placing a student in a community service and literacy role understand what the regulatory requirements of those roles are. And then we've had some institutions who don't allow students to work during periods of non-attendance, and we talked about it a little before. Make sure that you understand under what conditions a student can work. So, for example, during the summer, students can perform federal work study functions. Just make sure that those students are scheduled to be enrolled in the next period of study. And so for us, the biggest challenge would be reconciliation and the job descriptions. But each of these areas within the federal work study program are really important because institutions oftentimes don't understand the federal work study requirements, and particularly since it involves so many different departments, whether it's payroll or academics or wherever the student might be working. But just make sure that you understand what those requirements are.
I have another question that came in, and this is more about awarding federal work study. Is it okay to award graduate students a higher amount of federal work study to give them the opportunity to earn more than their undergraduate colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, the institution determines what their federal work study awarding policies are. And so as long as you are, as long as you have federal work study funds available throughout the year for those students, then absolutely.
Great.
And particularly if the cost for those students is higher.
Oh, great point. Excellent. And great question as well. All right, number 5, and we're reaching the halfway point with our top 10 list. Overall student eligibility. Lots of areas to uncover in here. Karen, what are we seeing are the top findings related to student eligibility overall for Title IV financial aid?
Yep. And so a lot of our questions surround the definition of a regular student, and so make sure that you understand what that definition is, and it's laid out in the handbook and in the regulations. But they have to be enrolled as a regular student in a program to receive FSA funds. And what we find once we peel back the layers on what that really means on campus is that in a lot of instances, our financial aid administrators, either through their system of record or through manual intervention, either can't validate that the student has met the academic qualifications for the program of study, either because they just don't have access to that information, it's in some other part of the system of record for which they don't have access to, or they don't have that information in a student's file someplace. And it's not normally what you would think that you would focus on from a functional perspective. And so you really have to rely on those partnerships with admissions and the registrar's office to make sure that all of those T's are crossed and I's are dotted. Again, we talked about self-certification of high school completion by the student. If the institution does not require that the student submit a high school diploma or other alternative evidence that they've completed high school, if you don't require that, then you can rely on that student's self-certification that they've completed high school and are eligible for Title IV funds. The enrollment status, we've had many instances where we found that a student was awarded full-time aid, but there was no way for the institution to understand when that student either was less than full-time or, more importantly, less than half-time as it relates to the loan programs. And so just understanding and partnering particularly with your registrar to understand what that student's enrollment load is really important. But then also determining as a financial aid department what actions you'll take based on changes in enrollment status. And so there are different requirements for Pell and direct loans, but in a lot of instances, those awarding criteria are not either documented or well known throughout the financial aid office. And then there's specific program eligibility. There may be a very unique program on your campus, and there are underlying requirements that the student needs to meet. And before or as a part of determining whether or not that student is an eligible student, you need to make sure that the institution needs to make sure that they've met those specific program eligibility requirements. And then on the contrary, there are some institutions that have what's called conditional acceptance. And the department doesn't really define conditional acceptance except to say that the student has to be accepted into the program as a regular student. And if you have some conditions on that student's acceptance into the program, from a compliance perspective, what we found is that in most instances, the aid office doesn't have access to that information. They don't know that the student has been conditionally accepted, and there's no internal control to ensure that the student ultimately meets the conditions of their acceptance into the program. And so, if you allow a student, accept a student into a regular program of study, and they are required to submit a final transcript, or it might be a graduate program or some professional program where they have to submit some test results or something, not test results for the student, like take the law school exam or something like that, or have a certain score by the end of a period. Whatever that condition is, there needs to be an internal control and a system of checks and balances to ensure that the student meets those conditions within the stated time frame. And I've really seen in the course of my career instances where students have graduated and they're still logged into the system of record as conditionally accepted. And so make sure that you understand what those conditions are and which office is responsible for ensuring that the student meets those conditions, and which office is responsible for communicating to the financial aid department when the student has not met the conditions, and what are the ramifications for that student. Because ultimately, you want to make sure that the student is eligible for the funds that you've awarded and potentially dispersed for that student.
Absolutely, because if not, then it's a potential liability, and we certainly want to correct for that and provide some control so that doesn't happen. Moving on to disbursement, that's a big topic area as well, and I think we have one time for a poll question. So I'd like to get a sense from the audience. We have a question here I'm going to launch on your screen. And so this will be a fun little, almost like a quiz-related question, if you will. So go ahead and let me know what you think. The maximum time a school has to issue a refund check for credit balances that result from the disbursement of FSA funds. All right, see, a lot of folks are responding here. Great. Yeah, keep the answers coming in, and in just a minute, we're going to go ahead and close the poll and show those results. All right, I've got the majority of votes in, and because we are running a little short on time, I'm going to go ahead and close that. So let's go ahead and share the responses here. So 83% of you got it right, 14 days. All right, Karen, on to you.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so disbursement, the application of funds to the student, whether you distribute a check or post it to apply it to their account, is the point at which a student becomes an FSA recipient. And so as a recipient, not only is the student responsible, the institution is then responsible because you've distributed funds to those students. And so within that category, we've noticed that Disbursement notifications and authorizations are challenges for the institution. Determining eligibility at the time of disbursement. The separation of functions is a big one. Disbursement reporting discrepancies, and we just talked about FSA credit balances. And so make sure that you understand what those notification requirements are, disbursement notifications, whether you, and they're different depending on how you require students, how you treat students, and the acceptance of their awards. And so if students are required to affirmatively accept their awards, you have a notification requirement. If there's passive acceptance, meaning they're not required to accept at all, you just distribute an award notice to the students. There's a different notification requirement. So make sure that you not only understand what those requirements are, but the timeliness of those notifications and who's responsible. We've seen instances where the financial aid department manages disbursement notifications, where the student accounts department manages disbursement notifications, but just make sure that you understand what they are, when they're required to be distributed, and who owns that function. The authorization to retain funds is what we're referring to here. And there are some institutions that, based on the cost of attendance and the type of aid that's available to students, there's never a credit balance, and so they're not retaining any funds on the account. And so just make sure that you have that policy documented, right? Because of the nature of our costs and aid eligibility, we don't retain funds on the account. But if a student is giving you the authorization to retain funds on their account, make sure that you look at the regulatory requirements for that authorization. They have the ability to rescind the authorization. There's a timeline for what you can and can't do with the authorization. And so there's specific language that needs to be included within the authorization, and whether or not they're authorizing you or anyone else to act on their behalf. And so we've seen no authorizations. We've seen authorizations that are just a written statement from the student. Just make sure that you understand that. And then again, eligibility at the time of disbursement goes back to being a regular student in an enrolled program of study, an approved program of study, evaluating satisfactory academic progress, understanding that the student is still enrolled at the same credit load. So just make sure that you have that internal check of the student's eligibility at the time of disbursement, which is really important. The separation of functions refers to no one person having the authority to authorize and disperse aid, and that's no one person or one office. And so make sure that, the financial aid department is not performing disbursement functions, and vice versa. And so we've seen all kinds of models across the country with our clients where the student accounts department may perform RTT4, the financial aid office performs RTT4. Financial aid disperses funds, and it's really important when you have a system of record that kind of muddies the waters in terms of the clearly defined separation of functions, because you can run a disbursement process, and ingrained within that process is the actual act of disbursement, which is delivering those funds to the student. And so remember, no one person or one office, and the one office is the part that we find that kind of trips people up sometimes. And then disbursement reporting discrepancies. The disbursement date in COD must match the disbursement date in the school's records every time, all the time. If you have a change in your system in your disbursement dates because of something that happened on site, or you forgot to include a holiday or exclude a holiday, make sure that you update those records in the COD system. And then again, we talked about FSA credit balances. Make sure that you understand what the time frame is for distributing those credit balances that are caused by FSA disbursements, and make sure that you have that partnership with the student accounts department to make sure that they too understand the time frame for distributing those credit balances.
All right, moving on to our next Big one, R2T4.
Yep, absolutely. And so the failure to identify and complete RHT4 calculations is the biggest one for us. And we find most often that it is for those schools that have non-traditional programs, whether they are non-term, non-standard term programs, where the academic calendars are different and the system of record either can't handle the academic calendar or there are some manual workarounds. We find that the communication of the identification of withdrawals is a challenge, and that is causing some of our client schools to fail to identify and just complete the RTT4 calculation as a whole. RTT4 calculation errors, we found a lot of instances where institutions fail to exclude holiday breaks or they calculated for the different the wrong percentage of scheduled hours completed. Aid that could have been dispersed is getting better, but we still find that there are institutions that are failing to include aid that could have been dispersed. So it's really important to look at that RTT4 worksheet or the RTT4 requirements in whatever form that you have it to make sure that that is at the top of your list for training so that everybody understands that aid that could have been dispersed must be included in the calculation. And then we talked about those non-traditional programs in RTT4, and I just want to briefly hit on programs with modules. It's really important to understand when a student is considered to have withdrawn from a modular program and that intent to return that the students are allowed to write if they withdraw from a particular course within a modular program. Make sure that you understand when you should receive that intent to return, because that's really important. And then what happens if the student doesn't return? And again, we can go through some of these more complex, detailed questions and programs if you have that need. After the webinar, we'd be more than happy to do that. And then the related consumer information, making sure that your constituents understand the withdrawal procedures and the difference between official and unofficial withdrawals, and more importantly, who the designated official is on campus. And in most instances, that's the registrar's office, but it's not always the registrar's office. It may be a dean or a dean of a particular program, but make sure that the consumer information related to withdrawal and the return of Title IV is accurate and available to your students.
Excellent. All right. Next up, federal program reconciliation. Let's talk a little bit about college and universities' responsibility when it comes to safeguarding federal student aid funds.
Yep. And so reconciliation looks really different depending on the client that we've serviced, and in most instances, it is a hybrid of an electronic process through the system of record and a manual process. But most important is performing reconciliation. And so I know that I've heard over the course of my career of the distinction between the requirements for Pell reconciliation and the requirements for DL. And there are a lot of institutions that reconcile DL monthly and Pell at the end of the year. And again, and the department specifically states it in the guidance, it's almost virtually impossible for you to manage your Pell funds if you don't reconcile until the end of the year. And so I would strongly encourage you to go back and really read the regulatory citations as it relates to Pell and DL reconciliation, and also your campus-based, and make sure that you, number one, perform it, but also document what those reconciliation procedures are and which offices are involved in reconciliation. Internal reconciliation would be all of the offices involved in your reconciliation process, financial aid and the business office or student accounts or the BURSAR, whatever you call it. But don't forget about your finance department and drawing down those funds from G5 and making sure that what you've reconciled for that month is accountable for in your G5 records, with the exception of a couple crossover days. but making sure that internal and external reconciliation is not only performed but documented, and then the timeliness of reconciliation. I cannot express how difficult it is to reconcile several months of federal program funds at
Mhm.
one time when you haven't reconciled timely. And so just make sure that your system of record can manage the reconciliation process. And I know that there are a few systems out there that have some quirks about what they can handle and what the system likes and what it doesn't like. And you have to document that, but just make sure that there is a clear, concise description of how you manage federal reconciliation and then the details, and also the details of your reconciliation process at both the aggregate level and at the student level. And that's important because we've experienced schools that have said, here we dispersed, $1.2 million and it matches COD, and COD says that. And then when you filter down at the student level, there are all of these discrepancies at the student level, but the aggregate dollar amount matches. And so just make sure that you understand what those program requirements are and that there's a partnership among all involved offices.
Partnership, that's a key word and incredibly important through
Yep.
all of this.
Yep.
Absolutely, right. Oh, having those great lines of communication, so everything's working seamlessly. Federal verification is a big one, certainly a topic, or I should say more of a category that has changed significantly over the last several years and can sometimes be a struggle to keep up with. We had a really interesting comment within the chat panel earlier, Karen, about institutional policies versus federal policies. And absolutely, we have to keep track and make sure that we are consistent with the federal rules and regulations. But also, the point was made in that question panel that if you have institutional policies that go beyond the federal requirements, from a program review perspective, you're required to meet those as well. So pay special attention to those. You have to follow those institutional policies if they're documented as such, in addition to those federal regulations. Such a great point. Thanks for sharing that.
Yep, and that is absolutely correct. And we've seen verification policies that are one page, and we've seen verification policies that are 15 pages. And, as you combine the functional approach to verification with the system of record and actual procedures for verification, they can be very, very different. But you're absolutely right. If the institution has a policy that goes above and beyond what the federal requirements are, if within a program review you've been found to not adhere to your own institutional policies, then you're out of compliance. And so be very, very careful about what you require from a federal verification perspective. And less is more sometimes, and sometimes as aid administrators, we're really, really smart, and we manage a lot of complex data in very short periods of time, but make sure that if you documented it as a written procedure, that you and all of your fellow colleagues at the institution are following that procedure. And make sure that you complete verification. A lot of times, particularly with large institutions and your system of record and electronic processes, you can miss a required federal verification. One of the things that we see most oftentimes is students in, for example, graduate programs. We just talked about that. And federal work study, students in graduate programs with eligibility for unsubsidized aid only, except that they're also receiving federal work study, and there's a federal verification requirement if the student is receiving federal work study, which is a need-based aid. And so just make sure that you understand who those students are, and just because they're graduate students doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to complete verification. And that can be a significant finding if you've done that across the board for all students in the program and they all receive some other type of federal need-based aid. Acceptable documentation has always kind of been the bane of existence for financial aid administrators, particularly when the data retrieval tool is down. And I understand that we might be required, be authorized to collect alternative documentation here in the very near future again. But, you know, as an institution, make sure that there is a written policy and understanding of what's acceptable documentation for the institution, not what's acceptable for Mary and what's acceptable for Johnny and what's acceptable for all of the aid administrators within the office, but as an institution, what's acceptable documentation, not only from a regulatory perspective, but what those alternatives are and whether or not you'll accept them as an institution. Again, conflicting information continues to be very, very complex because it can be subjective. But what we recommend is that as an institution, you document not only what is conflicting for your financial aid office, but what is not conflicting for your financial aid office. And so a lot of times we see in our client schools, you know, where exemptions different from household size is considered conflicting information. And a lot of times you get tripped up on marital status and making sure that you really follow that student and look at the student and the parents holistically. And so making sure that you understand and that your staff and therefore your students understand what's considered conflicting information from a regulatory perspective and how they can resolve it. Make sure that's a clear understanding on your campus. Because I can't tell you how many times we've looked at, you know, files at the same institution that had a different application of verification policies among the different aid administrators. And then having those required policies and procedures, what's required to be documented from a verification perspective, what's required to be within your policy. For example, you know, the time frame for the submission of verification documents. And then just verification errors, just oversight, and a lot of times there's such high volume, particularly in those peak processing times, that you just want to get through the files and you'll look at it and audit it later. And as aid administrators have learned over the course of the years, later almost never comes until you actually make a time for later. And so make sure that you complete verification, that you understand what's acceptable documentation, but most importantly, document what's conflicting and what's not conflicting in your financial aid office and develop systems and internal controls to make sure that you audit periodically to make sure that your staff is following those policies and procedures.
Excellent.
Okay,
Yeah, so we're at our number 10, the administrative capability category, which really can be a result of multiple findings within the areas that we talked about before, right, Karen? And this can be a very scary thing. So let's jump right into it. Let's talk about what administrative capability is and what can happen if there are multiple findings that the Department of Education determines that a school isn't quite meeting administrative capability.
Yep, and so that administrative capability and truly a lack of administrative capability is really scary to hear. And there's a list, obviously, and some of you have, most of you hopefully have seen that list, but there's a whole list of regulated requirements under the administrative capability citations. And so it really is truly a compilation of errors in multiple different categories, or in one category that is so egregious that the institution has been deemed to have a lack of administrative capability. And so when you think about that, the top 5 administrative capability trends in any combination are a lack of internal controls, and we've mentioned that on this webinar, just making sure that you can control the administration of Title IV aid, and that may mean controlling the written policies, controlling your system of record, controlling the flow of information, controlling the security of student information. But within those internal controls, also establishing checks and balances and making sure that what the policy that you have in writing is the policy that you've actualized in your operation. And I can't express enough, and I know that this is tough for aid administrators in terms of backup and making sure that people are cross-trained. But I, the number of times that we've seen throughout our compliance assessments or business process reviews where there's staffing shortage, or there's open positions, making sure that as best you can, and we've certainly had conversations with college presidents and executive level leadership on college campuses about stabilizing the student services entity within the college because the alternatives are risk to continuing to participate in Title IV programs. So establishing those checks and balances and making sure that you have your finger on the pulse of all of those critical compliance areas. And so the administrative capability or the lack thereof is really having multiple findings that exceed the DOE program review threshold. And in general, within a particular finding, if the error rate exceeds 10%, some of you may have experienced this, then the program reviewers have the authority to expand the sample. So if they selected 30 files and tested them for federal verification, and you have 3 or more errors, then they have the ability to expand the sample. And expanding the sample could mean expanding it to 50% of your population, 100% of your population. And so those things can become quite daunting when you're faced with that situation. And so it's really, really important for you to establish an internal policy of, pull 5 files every quarter and validate it and audit it and make sure that your staff is following the policies and procedures that you've established, and those institutional partnerships are strong and healthy. And having those required policies and procedures is really important. And so while the Department of Education doesn't require that you have a manual per se, there are some components of the administration of Title IV that are required to have written policies and procedures. For example, verification and withdrawal and the return of Title IV. And then we talked about adequate staffing. And so each of these individual areas alone, if egregious enough to establish a lack of administrative capability, or a combination of these areas, could establish a lack of administrative capability. And the consequences for that are twofold. Number one, your ability to continue to receive Title IV funds is at risk. And number two, the opportunities for your students are at risk. And so when you think about all of the areas that we've talked about today and the subcategories within those top 10 findings, it's really overwhelming. And so it's important to look at the standards of administrative capability and develop an approach for addressing each of those standards. And so what we mean by addressing is you're not going to fix everything tomorrow. Aid administrators have learned that and have experienced that over the course of years, but really having a coordinated, strategic approach to understanding what the requirements are, but more importantly, making sure that you can communicate those requirements effectively to those that impact them and that are outside of the purview of the financial aid administrator. And I think that sometimes that's our biggest challenge. I can't tell you how many times we've gone on site, and when we go on site and conduct a compliance assessment or a business process review, we really do try to become a part of the fabric of the institution so that all of the offices involved in the administration of financial aid and Title IV are comfortable in helping us to understand where there are strengths and where there are areas of opportunity. So strategically establish those relationships and make sure that each of these standards of administrative capability, many of them that are not owned and controlled by the aid administrator, are well known throughout the institution, because that's your best opportunity for success.
We have some very detailed top 10 takeaways and suggestions for you to take this information back to your campus, to talk with individuals within your financial aid office and those interrelated offices as well, to make sure that tightening up the processes so that everything that we're doing is compliant, not only with the federal regulations, but also our internal policies as well. And while we didn't have a chance to get into how we conduct these deep dive assessments on campuses, we would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about our approach after the session today. Please do not hesitate to reach out and contact us. And also, please take a moment to complete the survey. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. One of the questions that we ask on there is what else you'd like to learn about from a compliance standpoint, financial aid operations management in general. Let us know what you'd like to learn more about, and we'd be happy to create some sessions to help support you. That's what we're here for. That's what we excel at, and that's what we love to do. We are here for you as your neutral third party to help you control your financial aid operations so you can maintain compliance in all of the work that you do, and also to help you best support the students and families that attend your institutions. So thank you again so much, Karen. Thank you for sharing your wealth of information. I know we had so much to get through today. It's almost impossible to touch upon everything. So thanks again. Thank you, Karen.
Absolutely, my pleasure.